Hi, this is The Blue Sword, Chapter 4. She stared out of her bedroom window at the moonlit desert. Shadows drifted across the pale sand, from wedge-shaded hollow to the next clump of dry bush. Almost she could pretend the shadows had direction, intention. It was a game she often played. She ought to be in bed. She heard 2 o'clock strike. The location and acoustics of the big clock that stood in the front hall were such that it could be heard throughout the large house it presided over. Probably even in the servants' quarters, although she had never had an occasion to find out and didn't quite dare ask. She often wondered if it had been perversity or accident, and for whatever reason, why it hadn't been changed. That the clock should be so located as to force the knowledge of the passing time upon everyone in the residency, every hour of day. Who would want to know the time when one couldn't sleep? She had insomnia badly when she was fresh from home. It never occurred to her that she would not be able to sleep without the sound of the wind through the oak trees outside her bedroom at home. She had slept admirably aboard the ship when apprehensions about her future should have been the thickest. But the sound of the ceaseless desert air kept her wide awake at night after night. There was something about it too like speech, and not at all like the comfort of murmur of oak leaves. But most of that had worn off in the first few weeks here. She had had occasional bad nights since then. Bad, she thought. Why bad? I rarely feel much the worse the next day, except for a sort of moral irritability that seems to go with the feeling that I ought to have been asleep all those silent hours. But this last week had been quite as bad, as sleepless as any she had known. The last 2 nights she had slept curled up in the window seat of her bedroom. She had had to come to the point where she couldn't even bear to look at her bed. Yesterday Annie, when she had come to waken her, had found her still at the window, where she had dozed off near dawn, and like the placid, sensible maid that she was, she had been scandalized. Apparently she had then had the ill grace to mention the matter to Lady Amelia, who, in spite of all the alarms and excursions of the past week, had still found time to stop at Harry's room at bedtime and cluck over her and observed her to drink some nice warm milk. Milk, thought Harry with revulsion, who had given it up forever at the age of 12 with her first grown-up cup of tea, and made her promise to try to sleep as if that ever had anything to do with it, and asked her if she was sure she was feeling quite well. Very well, ma'am, Harry replied. Lady Amelia looked at her with concern. You aren't fidgeting yourself about, like last week, are you? Harry shook her head, smiling a little. No, in truth, I am in excellent health. She thought at the end of the conversation she had heard 2 days past, as Dedham and Peterson left Sir Charles's study without noticing her presence in the hall behind them. Don't like it one bit, Peterson was saying. Dedham ran his hand over the top of his close-cropped head and remarked half humorously, You know, though, if in a month or year from now one of those here folk comes galloping on a lathered horse and yells the pass, we are overwhelmed. I'm going to close up the fort and go see about it with as many men as I can find and worry about reporting it later. The front door had closed behind the 2 of them, and Harry proceeded thoughtfully on her way. I hope you're not sickening for anything, child, said Lady Amelia. Your eyes seem overbright. She paused, and then said in a tone of voice that suggested she was not sure this bit of reassurance was wise, as perhaps it would aggravate the nervous condition instead of soothing it. You will understand, my dear, that if there is any real danger, you and I will be sent away in time. Harry looked at her, startled. Lady Amelia mistook her look and patted her hand. You mustn't distress yourself. Sir Charles and Colonel Denham take care of us. Yesterday Harry had managed to corner Jack when he came again to closet himself with Sir Charles for long mysterious hours. Harry had lurked in the breakfast room till Jack emerged looking tired. His look lightened when he saw her, and he greeted her. Good morning, my dear. I see a gleam in your eye. What bit of arcane Darmarian lore do you wish to wrest from me today? What was it exactly you said to Corlanthe that morning when he left? Said Harry promptly. Jack laughed. You don't pull your punches, do you? He sobered, looking at her quizzically. I don't know what that I should tell you, but I will. In the days of Damar's civil war, a man pledged himself so to his king, or to a particular claimant he wished to support. It was a particularly dangerous and unsettled time, and so the ritual of swearing to one's leader meant quite a lot. more, for example, than our Queen's officers taken an oath to her, as we all must do. The phrase still carries weight in the Hill tradition. But you see, my giving it to Corlanth was a trifle unprofessional of me, as a homelander protecting the homeland border from Corlanth. A calculated risk on my part. He shrugged. I hope to indicate that not all homelanders are unsympathetic to the free hill folk, whatever the official attitude is. Harry lay down on her detestable bed after Lady Amelia left her and dozed after a fashion till midnight. But then the darkness and peacefulness wakened her, and she came again to her window to watch the night pass. 2:30. How black the sky was around. The stars near the horizon were longer, flatter glints in the darkness, unsuitable for stars. And there were the mountains and the desert, shades of gray. Without realizing it, she drifted into sleep. There was the residency, stolid and black in the moonlight. Farron and Inanth would stay here with the horses. It was not safe to take them any closer. He would go the rest of the way on foot. Safe. He grinned sourly behind the safety of the gray hood pulled over his face and slid into the shadows. The adventure was upon them, good or evil. Sola, not an outlander, Farron had begged almost tearfully. And Corlanth had flushed under his sun-darkened skin. There had been certain romantic interludes in the past that had included galloping across the desert at night, but he had never abducted any woman whose enthusiastic support for such a plan had not been secured well in advance. Corlanth's father had been a notorious lover of women. Unsuspected half-brothers and half-sisters of the present king still turned up occasionally, which kept the subject in everyone's mind. Corlanth occasionally thought that his own policy of discretion in such matters only made his people nervous because they didn't know what was going on, or if anything was. For some time now there hadn't been. But by the gods, did his own writers really expect him to break out by making an ass of himself over an outlander, and now of all times? But on the other hand, he could not well explain his reasons, even to himself. Although his determination was fixed, as he had unhappily realized the moment the words were out of his mouth. But he hated to see his people unhappy, because he was the good king, not because he was a nervous one. And so, while he could ruefully have told Farron to let it be, he had given much of an answer as he could. "This is affair of state," he said slowly, before he could not quite bring himself to say that his Kilar was concerning itself with an outlander, even to his writers, who were his dearest friends as well as his most trusted subjects. "The girl will be a prisoner of honor, treated with honor by me as well as you." No one had understood, but they were a little soothed, and they avoided thinking about the unwritten law in their land that said that a kidnapped woman had been ravished of her honor, whether she had been actually ravished of anything beyond a few uncomfortable hours across someone's saddlebow or not. It was generally accounted a honor for a hillman or woman to be seduced by a member of the royal family, which was why Kilar, originally a royal gift, continued to turn up in odd places, if a somewhat uncomfortable honor, for who could be entirely at ease with a lover who must never quite meet one's eyes? And outlanders were particular, as everyone knew, so who did know how they might react? Sola? Farron wavered, and Corlanth paused and turned a little toward the man to indicate that he would listen. "Sola, what will happen when the outlanders find her gone? What of it? They will come after her? No, not if they do not know where she has gone. But how could they not know?" Corlanth said grimly, "Because we shall not tell them." Farron, by his own choice, had not been one of those who accompanied his king to the council of the outlanders. Forley and Inanth and the others who had gone were wearing smiles to match the king's. The outlanders could not see what happened under their very nose. "You shall leave here at once and travel slowly across the mountains. Set up camp again where the leak spring touches the surface. Then you will wait for me. I will return the way we came, in secret, in 3 days' time, so that the girl will not disappear too soon after the hill folk were seen in the outlander station. Then I shall take the girl from her bed as she sleeps in the big house and ride back to you." There was a meditative silence. At last Farron said, "I would go with you, Sola. My horse is fast." His voice was still unhappy, but the quaver was gone. He looked at the faces of the 6 riders, who had been with Corlanth when he spoke with the Outlander commissioner, he began to feel curious. He had never seen an Outlander, even from a distance, never looked upon an Outlander town. After 3 restless days at the deserted campsite, Corlanth, Faran, and Enath rode quietly back towards the Outlander town. Corlanth thought, they couldn't see us, even in broad daylight, when we galloped towards them with cloaks flapping and horses whinnying. We creep in like burglars to an empty house, pretending that it has an owner because we can't quite believe it is this easy. Faran and Enath knelt down where they were and did not look at theirs. Their king left, for they knew they would see no more than he wished them to see. The horses waited as silently as the men, but the king's bay stallion watched him go. The only sound was the wind whispering through the low brush and the horses' long manes. Corlanth reached the house without difficulty. He had expected none. Watch dogs ignored him, mysteriously counted him a friend. There were several black and brown fuzzy shapes lying about sullenly snoring in the residency garden. Outlander dogs did not like the northeast border of Daria, and hill dogs, who would have awakened at once and watched him silently, did not get on well with Outlanders. He passed the stables, but the grooms slept as heavily as the dogs. He couldn't see in the dark, but even in the places where the moonlight was no help, he knew where things were. He reached the wall of the house and laid a hand on it. Depending on what sort of mood his Kilar was in, he could occasionally walk through walls without knocking them down first, or at least see through them. And then again, sometimes he couldn't. It could be tiresome if he had to break in like the common burglar he felt, and wander from room to room looking at faces on pillows. There was even the remote chance he could get caught at it. No, this wasn't going to be one of those times. The Kilar was with him. Since it had gotten him into this dilemma, he thought at least it was going to help him get out of it, and he knew almost at once where she was. His only bad moment was when the damned clock in the front hall tolled like a call for the dead, and seemed to reach up the stairs after him like cold, pale hands. She was curled, drooping and asleep on a cushioned shelf built out from a curved window, and from a moment pity struck him, and he hesitated. What good will pity do me? He thought almost angrily. I'm not here by choice. But he wrapped the cloak around her unnecessarily with tenderness as he breathed a few words over her head to make sure she would sleep. Harry struggled out of some of the oddest dreams she'd ever had into a dim and foggy reality full of bumps and jolts. Was she ill? She couldn't seem to make out what was happening to her, save that it was very uncomfortable, and it was not at all like her to have difficulty waking up. She opened her eyes burrowly and saw something that looked like dawn behind something that looked like hills, though she was a long way from them. Where she was, she then realized, was slung sideways across a horse's withers, with her feet sliding across his shoulder with every stride, no more comfortable for him than me, and she was held sitting upright with an arm around her middle that clamped her arm to her sides, and her head appeared to be bouncing against a human shoulder. Her only notion, and it wasn't very, was that she was perfectly capable of riding a horse herself, and resented being treated like a bundle or a baby, so she struggled. She raised her head with a gasp and shook her face free of the deep hood pulled over it, and tried to sit up a bit farther and turn a bit more to the front. This caused the rider to rein the horse in abruptly, except she realized there were no reins. The rider seized her a little more firmly, and then there were 2 other men on horseback beside her, and they dismounted and came over towards her at once. They were dressed like hill folk, with hoods pulled low over their faces, and quite suddenly, not understanding what had happened to her, she was afraid. The rider who held her handed her down to the men beneath, and she noticed that the shoulder her heels were knocked about was bright bay, and the mane long and black. Then, as the 2 men caught her by the arms, her feet touched ground, and she fainted again. She woke once again in the twilight, but this time the red glow came from the opposite direction. This time she woke feeling more like herself, or she thought she did, but her surroundings were so unlikely she wasn't sure. She sat up and discovered she could. She was lying on a blanket, still wrapped in a cloak, a hooded cloak that wasn't hers, and beneath she discovered she was still wearing her nightgown and the dressing gown over it. She was barefoot. She spent a light-headed minute or two trying to remember if her slippers she had disappeared or if she had never put them on. Last night or wherever it was, caught herself here and looked around. She was in a bit of a hollow with a scrub-covered dune behind her. Over her was a sort of tent roof pegged out in a square but with only one side let down. The other three offered her a view of the dune, the sunset, if that was what it was, and three men crouching over a tiny smokeless fire built against the opposite arm of the sand dune. Around its edge she could see the black hills faded in the last light, and three horses. Three lumps that might be saddles lay near them, but the horses, a gray, a chestnut, and a blood bay, were not tethered in any way. She had only just looked at these things when a first quick glance, and had not yet begun to puzzle over them when one of the men stood up from the fire and walked over to her. And the other two appeared to pay no attention, remaining bent over their knees and staring into the small red heart of the fire. The third man knelt down near her and offered a cup of something in it that steamed, and she took it at once without thinking, for the man's gesture had been a command, and when she held it and looked at it, whatever it was brown, and it smelled delicious. Her stomach woke up at once and complained. She took the cup, and then she looked at the cup and then at the man. He was wrapped in a cloak, and he could not see his face. Almost after a moment, he gestured again at the cup she held and said, "Drink it." She licked her lips, wondered how her voice were going to sound. "I would rather not sleep any more." This came out pretty well. There was a pause, but whether it was because he did not understand her, his accent was curious and heavy, although the Homelander words were readily recognizable, or was choosing his answer carefully, she could not tell. At last he said, "It will not make you sleep." She realized that she was much too thirsty to care whether or not she believed him, and she drank it all. It tasted as good as it smelled, which she thought gave it points over coffee. Then she realized she was now terribly hungry. "There is food if you wish it." She nodded, and at once he brought her over a plate of food with some of the hot brown drink. He sat down again as if with the intention of watching each mouthful. She looked at him, or rather at the shadow beneath the hood, then she transferred her attention to her plate. On it, beside the steaming hump of what she took to be stew, was an odd-shaped spoon. The handle was very arched, the bowl almost flat. She picked it up. "Be careful," he said. "The sleep you have made makes some people sick." So she was drugged, she thought. It was a particular relief in this, as if she now had an excuse to remember nothing at all of how she had come to be where she was. She ate what she had been given. She felt the better for it, though the meat was unfamiliar to her. But the feeling better brought into unwelcome prominence all the questions about which she was, where she was, and why, and worst, what's next? She hesitated, looking at her now empty plate. It was dull gray, with a black symbol at its center. She wondered if it meant anything. She thought health and a long life, a charm against getting broken or lost, or a symbolic representation of death to outlanders. "Is it well?" the man beside her asked. "I would be more comfortable if I could see your face," she said, trying to strike a clear tone among reasonable timidity and dreaded cowardice and politeness over one's captor. She threw back his cloak and turned his head so his face was clearly visible above the fading light behind him. "My God," she said involuntarily. It was Corlanth. "You recognize me, then?" he inquired, and at her startled nod, "Yes, Your Majesty," she thought, but her tongue was glued to her teeth. He said, "Good," and stood up. She looked dazed. He wished he might say something to reassure her, but he couldn't explain it to his own people why he was doing what he was doing. He knew he would be able to say nothing to her. He watched her, gathering her dignity about her and settling it over her stricken expression. She said nothing further, and he picked up her plate and took them back to the fire, where Ina scrubbed them with sand and put them away. Harry was too busy with her own thoughts to suspect sympathy from her kidnapper. She saw him as a figure in a cloak and watched him join his men at the fire, neither of them looking her way. One stamped out the fire and packed the cooking utensils in a bag. The other saddled the horses. Corlett stood staring at the hills, his arms folded, his cloak shifting in the breeze. The light was nearly all gone, and she soon could not discern his still figure against the background of the black hills. She stood up a little shakily. Her feet were uncertain against her, and her head was uncertain as so far from the ground. She walked a few steps, and the sand was warm underneath, but not unbearably so. The two men, still without looking at her, slid past her, one on each side, and dismantled the tent, rolled it up, and stored it away so quickly it seemed almost like magic. And as the last bag was fastened to a saddle strap, Corlett turned. Although no word had been spoken, the red bay followed. "This is Ishmael," he said to her gravely. "You would say, perhaps, Fireheart." She looked at the big horse, not sure what response was required. She felt that patting his great beast would be taking a liberty. To do something, she offered him the flat of her hand, and was foolishly gratified when he arched his neck, lowered his nose until his breath tickled her hand. He raised his head again and pricked his ears at Corlett. Harry felt as if she had just undergone some rite of initiation, and wondered if she had passed. The other two men approached them. The other two horses followed. Am I about to be slung over the saddle bow like a sack of meal again? She thought. It was more difficult to do the slinging. Is it more difficult to do the slinging when the sack in question is standing and looking at you? She turned her head away, whereupon the other two men were found to be looking intently at the sand around their boots. The baggage was all tied behind their saddles, and the hollow they stood in looked as bare and undisturbed as if it had never sheltered a campsite. She turned her head back to Corlett again. "I can ride, at least a little," she said humbly, although she had been considered an excellent horsewoman at home. "Do you think I might sit facing forward, perhaps?" Corlett nodded and let go of the horse's mane. He adjusted a leather-covered roll of fleece at the front of the saddle, then turned to her. "Can you mount?" She eyed the height of the horse, 18 hands, if he is an inch, and she thought, and that might be conservative. "I'm not sure," she admitted. Then, to the horror of the other two men, the puzzlement of Fireheart, and the surprise of Harry herself, Corlett knelt in the sand and offered her his cupped hands. She put a sandy foot in the hands and was tossed up as easily as she were a butterfly or a flower petal. She found this a bit unnerving. He mounted beside her with the little simple grace she'd seen in the residency courtyard. The other two horses and their riders came up behind them. They wheeled together to face the hills, and together broke out into a canter. Harry could detect no word or gesture of command. They rode all night, walking, canter, and brief swift gallop. Harry was bitterly tired before the line of hills before them began to emerge from a graying sky. They stopped only once. Harry slung her leg over the horse's withers and slid to the ground before any offer of help could be made. And while she didn't fold up where she stood, there was a nasty moment when she thought she might, and the sand heaved under her like a motion of a horse galloping. She was giving bread and some curious green fruit and something to drink. And Corlett threw her into the saddle again with his men, while his men bit their lips and averted their eyes. She wound her hands in Fireheart's long mane, stiffened her back and blinked, and willed herself to stay awake. She said she could ride, and she didn't want to be carried, wherever they were going. She wasn't going to think about that, just think about sitting up straight. Once when they slowed to a walk, Corlett handed her a skin bag and said, "Not much farther now," and the words sounded kind, not scornful. She wished she could see his face, but it was awkward to twist around to peer at someone who was just behind one's shoulder, so she didn't. The contents of the bag burned her mouth and made her gasp, but she sat up the straighter for it. Then she stared at the line of hills and squeezed her eyes shut and opened them again, and was sure that the sky was turning paler. She was not imagining things. The three horses pulled up to a walk and then halted, ears forward. Corlent pointed, so to Harry it seemed that a disembodied hand and arm materialized by her right cheek. There. She followed the line his fingers indicated, but she saw only waves of sand. The horse leaped forward at a gallop, and appalled her with its swiftness. At the end of such a gallop, the shock of each of Fireheart's hoofs striking the ground rattled her bones. When she raised her eyes from the lift and fall of the black mane over her hands, she saw the glint of white and of gray shapes too regular to be dunes. The sun broke golden over the hills as the three horses thundered into the camp. End of chapter 4.